Join me in welcoming Antonio Hattaway.
All right, hello everybody. I hope you all are having a good morning. So this is my presentation on understanding genocide, a call to action within Palestine and the world. It is a very sensitive topic with a lot of information behind it. So I am aware that there is a lot of interest in this topic kind of across the board. On these flyers, there is a QR code. It will be also available at the end of the presentation. It will lead you to a YouTube channel where I'll upload a recording of this presentation, as well as all the material used to present. Also up here are printouts of my works cited pages in case you would like to personally review any of the information without having to come to me for it. A lot of information, a lot of scholarly articles, a lot of books, especially regarding this information. As mentioned, I would appreciate if any comments or questions are held until the end of the presentation, because some of you do have places to go afterward, so I would like to get you all out of here if you need to get out of here as soon as possible. And so I guess before that, are there any questions before I begin? Just so we can get that out of the way. Alrighty. So,
Mine is timed out.
It's the same thing that it did when I was presenting.
okay, I'll just do that manually. So, content disclaimer, there is a lot of sensitive information within this talk. I have taken pretty careful measures to avoid any graphic imagery, videos, or audios, because I know that can be very triggering and kind of shut off the possibility for discussion around the subject if you see a lot of graphic imagery. There is this imagery that is very easily accessible. It is the majority of what's coming out of current ongoing situations. And again, all this information is cited within these pages. That will be available at the end of the presentation, as well as on these printed out sheets. And I would like to set forth some expectations and I guess some hopes for me regarding this format. I'm going to be going over the history of the region of Palestine, and I'm going to be going over the context of the word genocide, how that came to be, and then how that relates to ongoing events. Because of the conversation, I am expecting there to be emotions in some way or another. While they're expected, they won't be shamed. So if you feel the need to express yourself in some way or another, feel free to. I will not judge you. I just ask that you are able to manage it in a way that allows us to continue having the conversation. And so to begin, the history of Israel and Palestine. So I'll be asking some questions throughout the presentation. These may be answered through the information. There is a lot of debate over the claim of nativity and indigenousness to the region. This has led to some debates over whether one group is more justified than another to solely, exclusively inhabit the region. So, question one is, are Israelis indigenous and are Palestinians indigenous? And does one have more claim? Question two is, given that the claim of Israelis being indigenous, why has a homeland only been established within the last 100 years? And lastly, a question of who are the Palestinian people and what is Palestine? So, as for some history, ancient Israelites originated from the region of the Levant, also known as ancient Canaan, sometime before 1000 BCE. These people were generally united by a shared sense of ancestry, experiences, culture, and religion that connects them all together as Jewish Israelis. Though I will like to preface, today even the people of Israel and Palestine are not exclusive to one stereotype of being Jewish or Muslim. There are Christian Israelis, there are Muslim Israelis, there are Jewish Israelis, and similarly there are Christian, Muslim, and Jewish Palestinians. Now, Israelis are indigenous to the land. They were kicked out at some point, which will be explained in a moment, but also Canaanites, who are the ancestors of the Phoenicians, who you might have heard from history class, who are the ancestors of the Palestinians, also originate from this region. A study was done that indicated that up to 50% or more of the Arabic Levant-speaking groups are descended from Canaanites. And so generally this establishes that both Israelis and Palestinians are native to the region. So given that, what happened? There was a diaspora within the 8th century BCE, I believe conducted by Rome, that kicked out many of the Israelites from the Levant and dispersed them throughout the world. This is why there are generally Israelis who are from Russia, who are from Germany, who are from many parts of Europe and many parts of Africa. And so the Israelites have been absent from the region for around 1,000 years. And for these thousands of years, the Jewish population within the Levant directly has remained very small up until the modern era. The region of Palestine was only referred to as Palestine by the Greeks in the 5th century. This is kind of when they were distinguished from being Phoenicians into Palestinians. And next is some more modern history. So we go to 1917, where the Balfour Declaration occurred. This was a declaration by a British Jew, I believe, that mandated the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jews. There was large-scale immigration from Eastern Jews, mostly Russian Jews, and so much of the population of Israel was consisted of Russian Jews from 1922 to the 1940s. However, as we all know, World War II occurred. This is when the term genocide originated from, with the genocide of the Jewish people and the Holocaust. I'll get more into detail on how the genocide of the Jews happened, but generally persecution increased and a large number of Jews tried to flee into other European countries, into America, and many fled into Israel. Many who tried to leave to other European countries or America were often refused. Here is a picture of 937 Jewish refugees aboard the SS St. Louis who were denied entry into America and turned back to Europe. This was seen oftentimes, and I want you to begin asking yourself, why were these people turned away? And that is a question that will build upon itself as we continue the history of the region and as we begin to explore the 10 stages of genocide. And so next is the UN partition plan. Up until this point, Palestine had not been a recognized country. It had been a region of empires throughout history. Before the British, it was the Ottoman Empire, and the 1917 Balfour Declaration had British control. In 1947, it did not want to control the region anymore, and so the UN proposed a plan that split the region of Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. It would have been 55% towards the Jewish state and 45% towards the Arab state. The Zionist leadership of Israel agreed to this plan, but the Arab League and the Palestinian population did not, as this would have made over half of the population refugees within alien rule overnight, basically. And given the history of the Israelites being absent from the region for 1,000 years, this was seen as a very provocative proposal. I'll also be showing a map later on of the region throughout 1917, 1948, and other time periods we'll talk about. The plan was accepted with 33 to 13, 10 abstentions. The US and USSR supported the resolution. Britain abstained because it did not want to deal with the region anymore. But now, as almost immediately after this plan was passed, something known as al-Nakba began. And al-Nakba translates literally to the catastrophe in Arabic, and it refers to a period of time over the span of a year in which 1.3 million Palestinians were displaced from their homes and land. And during this period, between 1947 and 1949, 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees from a population of 1.3 million. During this time period, 530 villages were destroyed, 15,000 Palestinians were killed across more than 70 massacres that are known today. Pictured are a Palestinian family leaving a home that would later be cleansed and then established into the Israeli city of Kiryat Gat, I believe. I might not be pronouncing many of the Hebrew or German names that come up. And below are Arab Palestinian prisoners who are being held by Israelis after the conquering of, at the time, unnamed village. And this was a period that has still to this day not been adequately addressed by the Israeli government. There are many Palestinians who are now referred to as double refugees, where they have been made refugees once, found a new home, and made refugees again, which is, as you can imagine, very, very difficult to continually recover from, especially considering this was in the last 100 years, so the last 2 generations at least. The next notable incident is the 1967 war. This is also known as the Six-Day War, in which, in less than a week, Israel seized the remaining Palestinian territories that were proposed during the partition plan, as well as some area from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. By the end of the Six-Day War, 300,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes again. Pictured are Israeli soldiers standing over captured Egyptians and Palestinians, as well as Israeli manned tanks patrolling in East Jerusalem. Next, in 1993 and 1995, the Oslo Accords were established. This was the first recognition of each other, where the Palestinian League as well as Israel decided to set aside their differences and try to reconcile, try to make peace. Oslo I was signed in 1993. This was an official recognition of each other, and pictured is President Bill Clinton overseeing a handshake which symbolized this recognition between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat. Oslo II, signed in 1995, was a way to detail this peace. It fractioned the land of the West Bank to try and give equitable control. As you can see though, 18% of the region, called Area A, was under Palestinian control. Area B, 22%, was under joint Israeli and Palestinian control. And 60% of the land, Area C, was under exclusive Israeli control. The exact specifics of how this agreement has worked out will be discussed as we reach the modern occupation that has taken place here. But now I'd like to go over the maps. So here is a map of Palestine in 1917. The green, which you can see, is the Palestinian population and Palestinian-controlled land. The blue is the Israeli-controlled land. This was during the Balfour Declaration. And next is the UN partition plan, which, as you can see, has turned much of the Palestinian land into Israeli-owned land, as well as completely separating 2 major facets of the Palestinian population into very distant, separate lands. Here is the area proclaimed by the Six-Day War. It's not very much different, but it does establish a firmer control. And then here is the modern day map from 1995, which shows a very fragmented West Bank. Now there are claims to contest these maps and the legitimacy of them, In the 1917 map, some claim that because there is no recognized Palestinian state, that the land did not legally belong to them, and so it's an unfair representation to show the land as theirs. I would say that generally this is fallacious in nature, because whether or not there is a recognized country does not give another the right to conquer and claim it as their own. This is much of the same reasoning we saw as the US began westward expansion and systematically took the lives of many Native Americans, as well as conquered their lands and put them into smaller and smaller boxes within our land. Another claim is that the lands were sparsely populated by Palestinians, that there weren't actually that many Palestinians living throughout these lands, and so it is an unfair representation because while they did control the land, it was not as it seems. However, given the statistics of the Nakba, which are recognized by many scholars today, it is unfair to say that these lands were not populated, as 15,000 were killed, over half the population was displaced, and thousands of families were irreparably changed. But now we begin historic occupation, which began in 1967. Many scholars recognize that as the starting point for Israel's apartheid state over the Palestinian territories. And in 1948, Israel had been created, though it has been observed by many international courts, many human rights observers, that despite international law, illegal settlements have been built continuously throughout the West Bank, as well as some within the Gaza Strip. And over the course of 50 years, more than 600,000 Israeli settlers had come to live on Palestinian land. This is described as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that was owned by Palestinians. Over 100,000 hectares of land were stolen, which I believe translates to about 300,000 acres. And over 50,000 homes and other structures were demolished or damaged or destroyed beyond repair. Israeli settlers are tried in civilian court. So if you were to be accused of a crime, you would go to civilian court, whereas Palestinians are tried in military court. So this is it creates a fundamental different set of laws in which are applied to the people of Palestine and to the people of Israel. Studies have shown that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, I believe over 800,000, have been arrested in these 50 years. And of those who are charged, 90 to 95% are convicted, and approximately 97% of those convictions are the result of plea bargains. So that creates a very unique picture in which the Palestinian civilians are able to be very easily persecuted and tried with very little chance of really escaping that accusation. And there are still to this day thousands of Palestinians who are being held under, I forget the term, but it is basically military detention, in which they can be picked up and put into jail without trial at the time. And it creates a very impossible situation for many of these people. And just 2 months into its occupation, so same year as 1967, Military Order Number 101 was issued, and this prevents and prohibits the organization of Palestinian groups, numbering more than 10, under anything that may be construed as political. So this effectively banned protests, both peaceful and nonviolent, and anyone who breaches this order will face up to 10 years of prison, as well as hefty fines. This order is still in effect today within the West Bank. You need a permit in order to be able to protest, a government that does not want you to protest. And in 2005, the Gaza blockade began. This is an air, land, and sea blockade, as well as an effective ban on anything that is not permitted by the Israeli government. In 2005, Israeli forces and settlers were withdrawn from the Gaza Strip. However, in 2007, following what is referred to as Hamas's takeover, Israel declared the Strip a hostile entity, citing security concerns, and has since severely restricted the movement of people, food, and goods. This includes medical goods, so people who suffer from diabetes can wait up to months for insulin to be approved just to get to them. Food has been severely limited. I'll point to a study later on that was conducted by Israel to find very specific circumstances in which they could enforce upon Palestinian civilians, which is rather disturbing, but you'll see that in a moment. And since then, there have been several major modern conflicts. In 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021, Israel has launched military offensives against Gaza. They all have very specific operation names. In 2008, there were 1,385 Palestinians who were killed as a result of that conflict. 2012, there were 168 Palestinians killed. 2014, 2,251 Palestinians were killed. In 2021, there were 261 Palestinians killed. And so between 2008 and 2023 of October, there were 4,065 Palestinians who were killed during the context of armed conflict within the Gaza Strip. However, between September of 2000 and February of 2017, Israeli forces had killed 4,868 Palestinians and 1,793 children outside of armed conflict. So this could be the result of protests, children who approached the border too closely, or people who were construed as threats for whatever reason cited by Israel Defense Forces. Now, I want to return to the Jewish Holocaust and go over the 10 stages of genocide. This is a format of which genocide has been kind of analyzed by Dr. Gregory H. Stanton, and it begins with classification, generally. These stages can occur out of order, in different orders, and can sometimes occur simultaneously. And so, as you may reflect upon genocides that we recognize today, you may find that some occurred in a very bizarre order to what we would recognize within the Holocaust. For the Jewish, classification is us and them. For the context of the Holocaust, there was an opera called The Ring of the Nibelung, which represented underground creatures as Jews, and they fought against the Aryan heroes of the story. This creates a barrier between people that makes it harder and harder as you progress to accept them as people. Stage 2 is symbolization. This is where you see labels or specific requirements of the oppressed people to identify themselves, such as the Yellow Star of David within Germany. In the Khmer Rouge, there were blue scarves that were required to be worn. Some Jews even had to have the word Jew inscribed upon their clothing in order to identify themselves further than the Star of David, in case that could be obscured in some way. Stage 3 is discrimination. Within Germany, the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, which legally defined Jews as a race. Any person with 3 Jewish grandparents were considered a Jew. However, that later degraded further into, if you had anyone who was related to you as a Jew, you were considered a Jew. Jewish people were considered a subject of the state rather than a citizen, and that stripped them of basic rights that are specifically ascribed to citizens. Within stage 4 is dehumanization. Dehumanization is where people are reduced to things. Within the Holocaust, there were several books and news articles that described Jews as less than human. There was a book called Der Giftblitz, which is the poisonous mushrooms in German. It depicted Jews as poisonous mushrooms that corrupted and poisoned German society. The story was kind of a children's tale to warn them of the danger that Jews posed to Germany. It reduced people into caricatures and objects that could easily be discarded. Stage 5 is organization. This is when you see governments begin to organize groups to begin persecuting people. The Nazi regime organized the Schutzstaffel, which is more commonly referred to as the SS. This was later used to enact the final solution, but initially was used to suppress Jews and eliminate general opposition to Nazi rule. Stage 6 is polarization. This is where people are made, when the difference of us and them is made into a fight of us versus them. This is where a stance is required to be taken, because if you stand on one side to the other, then you are supporting them. This is where signs such as Jews not allowed, or graffiti and damage to structures was mainly committed as a show of violence against another. Stage 6 is preparation. This is where the organization committing these atrocities will tend to prepare and discuss how they want to carry this out. In 1942, Nazi officials gathered to discuss the final solution, and this is where preparation began. Stage 8 is persecution. This is where you might see the oppressed person begin to be killed in invasions, in riots between people. But before that, you might see the oppressed be organized into ghettos, into segregated areas, forced out of business, and they're more actively, intentionally oppressed. This is where, if you've heard of, for example, the Warsaw ghettos, this is where Jews were beginning to be put into areas where they could be easily identified, gathered, and rounded up. This is also where most property was destroyed. Stage 9 is extermination. This is the most overt form of genocide, which we generally all recognize. This is where concentration camps were established to murder Jews en masse. They tend to use the most systematic and industrial form of murder that the organization has access to. For the Germans, it happened to be concentration camps and gas chambers. Stage 10 is denial. This is where you will see groups, sometimes completely unrelated to the oppressor, begin to deny any evidence of these atrocities happening. I imagine that you all have seen people who have denied the Holocaust before, whether in the news, on social media, or in some way or another denying the existence of these atrocities. And so these are the 10 stages of genocide. For the Jews, it happened very systematically from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. For many, though, it does not happen as neatly, I should say. And so we'll continue to return back to the Palestinians and first address the importance of language. Language is obviously the most important tool that we have as people to communicate, to share ideas, to broker peace and war. And there's something known as a euphemism, which is the substitution of an agreeable or inoffensive expression for something that might be unpleasant. An example of this is if you've ever heard the term passed away instead of died, or if you've ever been told by an employer that they have to let you go. These are euphemisms that generally have less emotional burden than the original term. And these are used very often, very intentionally by both people in power and organizations in power. When language is used, it can have a massive impact. It can be misleading, galvanizing, or suppressive, such as during the imperialization of Africa and colonization of America. During colonization and imperialization of India and the African continent, imagery depicting brown and black people as savages and uncivilized was not hard to find at all. If you've ever heard the poem The White Man's Burden, this is a poem that depicts the white man as having a burden to civilize and uplift the inferior races. Pictured here is, on the bottom left is, I believe that's bottom left, is a picture of Christians civilizing and bringing God to barely clothed African children, as well as a comic made by Dr. Seuss depicting black people acting as nothing less than characterized savages. This language is used very intentionally here to allow the colonization of these places and allow these acts of violence to be carried out on these people, because it creates an image of lesser. And if something is lesser, then you have less responsibility to care. This language is also used modernly, such as during Hurricane Katrina. There were often stories about people who had to find food and resources after the hurricane destroyed much of their homes. Pictured above is a young black man who was described as looting a store for resources. And pictured below is a white pair who was described as finding bread and soda. This language is able to paint a very clear picture of what they want you to see and what they want you to think. If you see someone is described as looting, you'll think that they're doing it maliciously, or that they are inherently a criminal. If you see someone described as finding, you're given an image of them as survivors who are doing their best to live. And this language continues to echo itself throughout history. Within Palestine, this language is also present. During the ongoing crisis, it has been used as a weapon. If you've been listening to the news and heard stories about it, you might have heard the death tolls described as Israelis being killed and Palestinians having died, which it takes away responsibility from Israel as the people who are killing the Palestinians, and it makes it entirely different. I'll play this clip from news anchor of BBC News, Jane Hill, saying in the same breath, I hope it plays the audio.
12 people, including 61 children, have died in Gaza. 12 people, including 2 children, have been killed in Israel.
And so this language is used and repeated very often. As an example, as a comparison, if you had a child and a teacher told you that your child had been shoved at school, that creates a very specific image in your mind of someone attacking your child or shoving them to the ground. But if they were to tell you that your child fell and tripped at school, that takes away the responsibility from if someone did shove your child. And so similarly, by saying that Israelis are killed, it means that someone did that intentionally, but Palestinians have died kind of just means that it just happened, and it takes the spotlight away. Language is also used as misdirection. There was a massacre on February 29th. It has been dubbed as the Flower Massacre. Since then, there have been 4 or 5 more of these identical massacres where the IDF escorted aid trucks that carry flour to Palestinians, and when they reached there, they were reported to have shot at the Palestinians. Seen here is a tweet from the IDF saying that Gazans were a mob looting the supplies who had been pushing each other, trampling each other, and had been run over by trucks, and that dozens were killed and injured in these tramplings. However, a study was done sampling over 200 dead and injured that revealed the presence of ammunition used by Israeli forces in a majority of these people. And so this language stalls immediate action by making it unclear how these injuries and deaths happened. It enables more to happen before it is questioned. And Palestinians have been dehumanized a lot. There's very accessible social media posts from people who live within Israel about Palestinians. There is tweets by the Prime Minister of Israel that regard Palestinians as the children of darkness, and that they symbolize the law of the jungle, while the Israelis symbolize humanity and are the children of light. This is rhetoric that was used by Hitler to describe their conquest and conflict with the Jews, where they were described as the children of light and children of darkness. This is another tweet by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Below, the second tweet describes this as a battle of Israel against barbarians, and it being a battle of civilization against barbarism. There is no shortage of Israeli officials who use this language to dehumanize and demean Palestinians. This is a former Israeli official. I have the original Hebrew post in case anyone here is able to speak Hebrew and would like to disprove the Google translated version of it. But towards the bottom, you can see her describe all Palestinians as Gazan monsters who will either try to flee through Egypt or they will die, and that it should be erased, and that anything less than that is immoral and unethical. This is only 3 examples of the hundreds that I came across in my research, and I figured that it would be best to show the incredibly disturbing language used by officials rather than the civilians on the ground. And there is concern of genocide within the region of Palestine. Craig Mukber, the former director of the New York office at the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, resigned as a result of inaction. He stated that the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist colonial settler ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging, based entirely upon their status as Arabs, leaves no room for doubt. This is a textbook case of genocide. And so I raise a question. Is it? Is what is happening in Palestine a textbook case of genocide? From Jewish scholar Raphael Lemkin, he is the one who coined the term genocide. He describes genocide as a coordinated plan aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of life, of national groups, so that these people wither and die like plants that have suffered of blight. This end may be accomplished by the forced disintegration of political and social institutions, of the culture of the people, of their language, their national feelings, and their religion. It may be accomplished by wiping out all bases of personal security, liberty, health, and dignity. When these means fail, the machine gun can always be utilized as a last resort. And so, with regard to this concern, many human rights activists, authorities, advocates, and scholars have claimed that the policies and actions that Israel has taken with respect to the Palestinian people have amounted to genocide. And so the next section is to look at whether or not genocidal intent can be proven. And first, I would like to look at some of the numbers coming out of Gaza, as well as some leaks from Israeli officials. In an email to the Department of Treasury, Israel officials told that it would keep Gaza's economy on the brink of collapse, as well as the Israeli defense minister announcing a complete siege of Gaza to allow no electricity, no food, no fuel, and that everything is closed to Gaza. And since October 7th, 2023, 32,783 Palestinians have been killed. This includes more than 13,000 children, 8,400 women, and that more than 74,694 people have been injured including at least 8,663 children, 6,327 women, and more than 8,000 people are reported to be missing. These numbers show an incredibly disturbing number, given that October 7th was 170 days ago. These numbers have come under contest because of the fact it is coming from a Hamas-run Ministry of Health. However, historically, these numbers throughout the various conflicts that I showed before were actually underrepresented by the Gaza Ministry of Health by about 12%, as well as other studies analyzing similar death rates of staff workers and Israelis, kind of correlating a line that would not be represented if the numbers were exaggerated. And so I want to provide a statistic of other modern wars compared to the child life lost within Gaza. And I'll give you a minute to read this. And generally, this graphic shows comparisons that don't really make sense at first. The sheer number of life lost within the last 170 days compared to years of other conflicts is by all means unacceptable and unmatched by any other modern conflict. The last one I want to point out is that within the first 80 days of bombardment, Israeli forces killed more children in Gaza than were killed in 11 years of war in Afghanistan. I can return to the slide later during the discussion period if anyone else wants to look at it, but I want to move on to the destruction of Palestinian life within Gaza. So, with Raphael Lemkin's assertion of genocide, that it is not just a extermination of the entire group, but a extermination of their foundations of life, we consider education and schooling to be one of the most important things of American life. It leads to employment, it leads to success generally, according to us. 281 state-run schools and 65 UNRWA schools have been completely or partially destroyed beyond the point of functionality. Every university within the Gaza Strip has been destroyed. The college students who are some of the most well-educated within the Middle East are completely unable to go to school and completely unable to learn anything. There are videos of some universities, I forget the exact one. There's one which was published by Israeli forces of them destroying a university from inside out after having used it as military barracks. The United Nations found that as of November 10th, 2/3 of primary care facilities and half of all hospitals in Gaza are not functioning at a time when there is unprecedented injury. Most hospitals that are allowing patients at all are over 300% capacity, to the point where the hallways are operating rooms. There is no anesthesia because of the complete blockade of everything into Gaza. Doctors are forced to operate without anesthesia on severe injuries and are forced to use vinegar or nothing as antiseptics. Only 8 of 24 UNRWA healthcare centers are operational as of November 10. Bakeries, curiously, have been targeted by bombing. Crucial food and resources are unable to reach the Palestinians within Gaza because there is no there's no general accepted place to go for this aid. The only source of aid so far has been rather underwhelming air deliveries, as well as the extremely limited amount of aid trucks allowed into Gaza. Only about 2% of the food required to feed Gaza's population has been delivered. And in a study by Israel around before 2012, there was an intent to find the minimum number of calories consumed or necessary for Palestinians to eat every day to keep them just above a humanitarian minimum of starvation and hunger defined by the UN. Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israel is only allowing in the absolute minimum amount necessary of aid. However, much of the people gathering to receive this aid are often shot at or unable to reach it because of heavily bombed regions or active bombing campaigns. Additionally, since 1967, 800,000 olive trees have been uprooted. In the first 5 months of 2015, the UN recorded 8,841 trees that were vandalized and uprooted, and in November 2022, 2,000 olive trees were uprooted. And to explain the significance of this, I'm wearing a keffiyeh. There are two patterns on it. One is olive leaves representing olive trees, and one is fishnets representing trade and fishing. To Palestinians, olive trees are incredibly important. It is one of the most important parts of their culture, and it is their #1 export from Gaza and the West Bank. To destroy the olive trees is to attempt to destroy their culture and to destroy something that means so much to these people who have been compressed into a very specific identity over the years. Alongside the total blockade, they are unable to also access their part of the culture, which is heavily represented by trade and their history in trading. If you remember that they are the descendants of the Phoenicians were known for trading within the Mediterranean. And so to take this away is a restriction of their culture and their identity. There's also reports reported by the Times of Israel and the Human Rights Monitor that Israel Defense Forces have caused major damage to 16 cemeteries and have dug up more than 1,000 graves, including over 150 freshly buried bodies. The reason for this is currently unknown, but it is a concerning statistic regardless. And a 2021 report by the Euromed Human Rights Monitor found that 91% of Gazan children suffered from conflict-related trauma. And additionally, I want to point out, over 53% of Gaza's population is children. So almost half of the entire population is suffering from conflict-related trauma, whether that is mental or physical. It is trauma that has been suffered intentionally by Israel. UNRWA estimates that some 75% of Gaza's population of 2.3 million people have been displaced. And this number only continues to grow as more and more regions are labeled as conflict zones by Israel and bombed. And I want to provide something more than just data. I did promise that I was not going to be displaying any graphic imagery, and I have kept that commitment. This is mostly the after effects of some of this, as well as some other things that are happening within the Gaza Strip that are particularly alarming for the state of human beings. So here is an image of an apartment building within Khan Yunis. As you can see, a very specific section of it was bombed and destroyed. And so this shows that Israel is capable of very surgical, precise strikes. And here is a picture from another town of Israel's bombing campaign. There is no sign of that incredibly precise bombing from before, and these campaigns are often carried out within hours. While I did not find the exact statistic, there have been enough bombs dropped within Israel or within Gaza to match the sheer volume of explosives caused by the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I believe I said that wrong. And here is two videos. One is a time lapse from December 1st to February 29th of Khan Yunis that shows you before, at this time, this was when Khan Yunis was identified as an evacuation zone. So this is where Palestinians were directed to go to safety and to avoid the conflict. And as you'll see during this time lapse, there is very rapid, indiscriminate destruction of places where people lived, places where people would gather and eat. And during a time when this is identified as an evacuation zone, it is concerning that to people who don't have access to electricity, to immediate fast access to evacuation calls, to have such a rapid, widespread bombing campaign. And I don't know how well this will come through in this video, but this is a video from Bisan. She is a journalist within Gaza who, for most of her career, dedicated her time towards showing the history and culture of Palestine, but has now been documenting the war. And there is a plane called a zanene, which creates this constant buzzing sound that has been reported to circle over their heads for 24 hours at a time, every single day, and commits to surveillance on these people. And it is unmanned, so it is able to fly constantly, all the time. It is, as you can imagine, very incredibly annoying. And to people who are already malnourished, to people who are already starving, and to people who are constantly being injured and attacked, the addition of not being able to get rest and not being able to feel secure and safe because there is a drone orbiting you at all times is something that I can imagine you all would not conflate with comfort, security, and anything you would associate with an evacuation zone. And I would like to also address that earlier statistic of 74,000 people who have been injured. With almost all hospitals within the Gaza Strip being rendered less than functional, it should be no surprise that many of these people will die from their injuries. And so the death count of 34,000 will very, very rapidly increase as disease from injuries set in, as people begin to succumb to their injuries, as people succumb to starvation, hunger, and malnourishment. And so one of the most important things is Hamas. Many people associate them with the cause for what is happening right now, and what blame they hold is a question I want to answer. In 1988, before the Oslo Accords, there was a charter from Hamas that called for the extermination of the Jewish people. This was during a time when the conflict was primarily Jewish versus Muslim. There was a rewriting of the charter conducted by people who represent a new part of the organization, distinguishing between Zionism and Judaism. And many of the leaders who were responsible for the original charter have been assassinated by now. So much of the ideas are no longer represented within Hamas. A UN General Assembly resolution in 1960 reaffirms the legitimacy of a people to struggle for independence and safety by all available means, including armed struggle. And this does not invalidate the deaths that did happen on October 7th. That the loss of innocent civilian life is unacceptable in any conflict scenario, but it does not warrant a bombing campaign that surpasses nuclear warfare. Hamas was also elected in 2007, and I would like to remind you that over half of the population is under the age of 18, which means that the oldest children would have been toddlers at this point. So the majority of the people who are suffering right now have zero responsibility or ability to affect what happened in 2007. And there's also something in the West Bank. This is not run by Hamas at all. The majority of the government is run by the PLO, by President Abbas. And this is an area without Hamas at all. There are still illegal settlements being built. As I mentioned before, Military Order Number 101 is still in effect. Hundreds have been murdered. At least 507 Palestinians have been killed in riots similar to early 19th century American race riots, as well as 124 children. 2023 was the highest year for casualties within the West Bank since 2005. Israeli forces, military forces, and militias have carried out raids, injuring over 4,382 people within the West Bank. And 3,500 new illegal settlements have been approved just as recently as March 6th. This is in areas where Palestinians have notoriously struggled to get the approval to even build schools. And there is an intention to continue occupying and disregarding Palestinian-owned land. And various human rights organizations have reported a lot of concern for the racially charged remarks that have occurred during conflicts. Most of the concern came from the 2014 conflict. There haven't been that many official reports done on this current ongoing crisis. And how Israel is able to do this comes from us, unfortunately. In 2022, $3.3 billion were committed to Israel for military aid. Since its founding, Israel has received over $300 billion in aid. Several elected senators and representatives have made very concerning comments regarding the operations within Palestine, to a point where it's disturbing enough for me to consider not having it in this presentation. I would be happy to share that with you after this presentation if you are interested. But more than just being complicit, our country is often compliant with this. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has made 2 emergency bypasses of Congress to supply over $250 million worth of arms transfers and equipment. The U.S. Security Council has used its veto power 3 times regarding ceasefires. On October 18th, one put forth by Brazil was vetoed. By the Secretary General of the UN, had invoked Article 99, that was vetoed. And also, February 20th was also vetoed. All of these vetoes were under the reasoning that there was US-led diplomacy happening on the ground, and it was under the request for that diplomacy to be allowed to carry out. However, it has only stalled continually the need for aid. You might have heard that there has been a ceasefire that was passed recently. However, there is still active raiding and bombing within Gaza. There is a hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital, which is actively under raid. Hundreds of hospital staff have been captured and taken away from their patients in spite of the ceasefire, primarily because the US has insisted that it is not actually binding. And this isn't an isolated incident. There are countless crises across the world. The Democratic Republic of Congo is facing a massive humanitarian crisis with over 6 million people displaced and slave-like conditions within molten cobalt mines. Sudan is facing a massive humanitarian crisis where over 8 million people are displaced and 18 million people are facing risks of starvation and severe hunger. Armenia and Manipur are both also under genocide warnings from the Genocide Watch. And this is all information that I could gather on just one crisis. This has taken me over a month to compile, and there is not enough time to even discuss this topic thoroughly. I believe through all of my evidence, through reading through the 84-page court case brought by South Africa to the ICJ, through reading several books regarding the crisis within Gaza, that there is a genocide ongoing. There is overwhelming evidence that culture, people, and all essential foundations and facilities are being targeted intentionally and destroyed. And these crises are equally as extensive and thorough in terms of history and context that needs to be addressed and looked at by people. And so, as we come to the end of my presentation, I want to talk about next steps. There is a lot we can do. It might not feel like that because of how far away this is and how much authority the government has exerted over us historically. One thing is that we can donate to families in need. I have attached to this presentation a link to a spreadsheet made by Operation Olive Branch, which has a list of families who are trying to leave the Gaza Strip through Egypt. It costs them about like $5,000 per person to leave in a situation where they don't have access to their banks, to their money, because it has been destroyed alongside their homes. We are able to send emails and calls to our representatives. I can talk to you after this presentation if you're curious about how to word it. I can also direct you to an automated way to do that if you have an iPhone. We are also able to spread awareness, to talk. The primary goal of this talk was to start a conversation here, to get this information out there, and to provide a platform for people to share ideas and learn. Talking about it, not letting the conversation die, is a nuisance to the people who are conducting these genocides. It's why denial is a stage, is because being able to deny it and talk about it in a way that makes it not exist is a way to guarantee that it can happen again to someone else. We're also able to continue to learn, to educate yourselves, engage with the world around us, and engage with it in a way that allows us to learn. This was not something that I knew anything about 5 months ago, and now I've compiled a three-page list of sources and books and court cases that help support the people of Palestine. There is also several apps that you can use to boycott businesses that don't align with your ideals. The No Thanks app allows you to scan any product, I believe, to see whether or not it aligns with your values. If you are interested in supporting the cause of Palestine, there is the BDS boycott list, which shows a list of corporations to boycott for different reasons in different ways. And lastly, to organize within your area. We aren't able to really change the top down, but we can gather together, organize our power as people and communities, and work to make change together. And that is the end of my presentation. Here is the works cited list on the slideshow for if anyone accesses it afterwards. And as we enter, the discussion afterwards, I would like to play a video in the background of a list of the 11,500 children who were killed as of February 2nd, 2024. It is slowed down enough so that you can read each name without losing it to the background scroll to the minimum. And I would just like to say, before I finish talking, if you were to attend a funeral every single day for each child killed in Gaza, just as of this date, a month ago, you would be attending a funeral every single day for 31 years. And so that should hopefully paint a very urgent picture of what is happening. And now I'm done.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for all of the research and sharing this information. Does anyone have any questions that they've written down for Antonio, or questions you'd like to vote on?
It kind of relates to this, the death of children. You've mentioned it several times, the high death toll among children. And I have like 3 reasons that come to mind, and I want to get either your opinion or the opinion of your sources. So obviously, the death of children is catching is horrendous. It makes us all feel something. So do you think it's kind of a way to draw attention and sympathy to these people? Is it just simple statistics? You mentioned that children are about 50% of the population. Is that why there's a higher death toll among this conflict rather than Afghanistan or Iraq? Or is it a deliberate targeting of children and the future of Palestinians?
I think that it is several things. I think that generally there is just going to be a high number of children killed because of how high of a population they make up. However, then comes the kind of suspicious reasoning why their population is so young. Poverty is linked to oftentimes a higher birth rate, and being kept intentionally in a position of poverty for several generations makes it difficult for anything other than a high population of children to manifest. I think that the reporting is kind of to garner sympathy because, you know, you see children mentioned alongside the deaths of women, and in conflict terms, the death of women and children is a horrific thing that shouldn't happen, and so it might be separated because of that. And I also think that there are children who are intentionally targeted. There was a story recently where a child had shot a firework from their home in celebration of Ramadan and I think the sun setting, and they were shot in the head by an Israeli sniper almost immediately. I don't even think the firework went off before he was killed. There's also reports from doctors describing what is happening even before October 7th as a mass disabling event where children and people are targeted to disable them. The list keeps going on for 17 minutes. I might be able to pull that up on the official Al Jazeera YouTube channel in a moment. But there's a term called kneecapping, where children and people are shot in the kneecaps to stop them from being able to recover, and it disables them almost immediately. This is seen a lot throughout the region where children are intentionally targeted. So I would say it's a mix of a lot of things, and the answer is kind of yes to everything.
Any other questions?
Regarding, there was a portion of your PowerPoint that stated the IDF was damaging the cemeteries. Would a possibility be that the population that faces persecution, they could go to the cemeteries and briefly hide? Would that be a possibility?
That can be a possibility. The reports that I got that from the Times of Israel describe the cemeteries as being used as military barracks by Israel. So I think that potentially it can be used as a place to hide. Currently within Rafah, that is the final evacuation point, which is currently under siege. There are people so tightly compressed that they are living near cemeteries. So I would say yes, as well as the other reported fact of Israel using the regions as barracks. So I think in some places yes, and in some places it's still completely unknown as to why they're digging up bodies.
Kind of feeding off of that, I think I read something about them using those spots as organ harvesting. Have you read anything about that?
I've read similar reports. I haven't been able to look into it enough to find concrete evidence behind that. But I have heard reports about that, yeah. And then if no one else has any questions, I will be here for a bit to discuss anything else that you might have. If you wrote anything on your, post-it cards that you didn't want to share, you can leave that at this podium area. If you are interested in taking a copy of my works cited list, it's right here. If you want to take a picture of the flyer to share the YouTube channel, which will have a recording of the presentation uploaded to it, please do so. And yeah.
Thank you.